of all, I want to thank Renata for this invitation for the seminar and for accepting me here as a visiting scholar at Ca' Foscari University. I will talk about some parallels about ethnobotany of migrant people in Brazil and multicultural perspectives in ethnobotany. So I want to share some of researchers in Brazil and some of our perspective related to ethnobotany. I will be a visiting scholar here in Ca' Foscari until September, but I'm a full professor at Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, Federal University of Santa Catarina, which is a university in the southern part of Brazil. As a summary, I will talk about the context and background, just to situate everybody about Brazil and this multicultural diversity. And then I will talk about a little bit about ethnobotany and traditional ecological knowledge. I will show you some case studies and share some perspectives for future studies. Well, first of all, I invite you to go across the ocean from Italy to Brazil, which is i partecipanti ora possono vedere la presentazione, which is a very big country. Just for comparison, there's some maps that show all the European countries fitting inside the Brazilian area, but I think there are some mistakes in these maps. But just as a comparison, it's a very huge country. Today we have more than 200 million people, and it's a mega diverse country too. We have 2 biodiversity hotspots, and Amazon is not considered an biodiversity hotspot. The 2 biodiversity hotspots are Atlantic forest and Cerrado, which is a savanna, Brazilian savanna. But most of the Amazon is in Brazilian territory. And we also have an important area for biodiversity conservation, which is called the Blue Amazon, which corresponds to the coastal area of Brazil with a rich biodiversity in the sea. Talking about biodiversity, there are lots of animals and plants already described, both vertebrates and invertebrates, plants, fungi, and lots of things already being described, and lots of species already being lost also. One thing that it's important is that for people who doesn't know Brazil, here in this room, anyone have been in Brazil before? No? Well, first time in Brazil, welcome. Probably you, when you hear about Brazil, maybe the first images are like Amazon, Rio de Janeiro, and Carnival and soccer, probably. Amazon is this part here. Let me see. I have is this part of the country, is in the northern part. This gray area is the Brazilian savanna or Cerrado. Here we have a semi-arid area. And this part, this green area here is the Atlantic forest. In this left map, we have the original cover. And in this right side, we have the actual cover of the original vegetation. So we can see that most of this original forest cover was already lost, especially when we talk about Atlantic forest, which was this large rainforest going all over the Atlantic coast here. See how this forest is reduced to small dots, small green dots in the image in the right side. And why does this happen? This happened especially because most of the population in Brazil lives in the Atlantic forest coast. This map in the left side shows the demographic density. More red, more people, more yellow, less people. So most part of the population is concentrated in this part of the country. And it also reflects in a huge inequality. We are unfortunately a country with a high inequality. In this right map, you can't see the numbers, but this is the percentage of population in Brazil living in poverty, which means people living with less than $5.5 a day per capita. And in some states, such as, where is this? Here. Such as here, Maranhão, more than 57%, in Amazonas, more than 50%, but the situations vary from north to south. For example, my state, which is this one here, where we live, 10% of the population is considered living in poverty. So this is this high inequality in the country. And what we used to learn in history when we are at school is that Brazilian history began in year 1500. I was reading about this room. This building was built 7 years before Portuguese colonists arrived in Brazil. So we are relatively, when you compare to Europe, obviously we are a very young country. Well, but what we are used to learn is that Portuguese colonists arrived in the year 1500, and then the history starts. But we are beginning to learn lots of things about the prehistory, the pre-Columbian history in South America. Probably Nivaldo can talk about more about this if you are interested. But then after, this is a very, very resumed timeline of Brazilian history. Portuguese colonists arrived, then we had an intense movement of slavery from Africa to Brazil during the 16th and until the 19th century. And then this labor was replaced by migrants from other parts of the world, from Europe, from Japan. And in the 20th century, we reached a democratic state. And all the economy during this timeline was based on exploitation of first wood, Brazil wood, and then gold, and then sugarcane, coffee, and areas for livestock and soybean plantation and industrial growth. This is a very summarized timeline. What we know today is that before Portuguese colonists arrived, we had at least 1,000 different ethnicities living in the territory that today we call Brazil. Between 2 and 4 million people already lived there, and there were more than 1,200 spoken languages, and some languages totally different from each other, different language trunks. Today, we have about 340 different ethnicities, less than 40 isolated groups of indigenous peoples, about 900,000 people, and 181 languages already spoken. And as an important measure of Brazilian government, since this year, we have a ministry entirely dedicated to indigenous people. This is the minister here. This one with the blue is Sônia Guajajara. Célia Chacriabá is another politician. This is a very important conquest in Brazil. We still have a long way to go to recognize indigenous rights, but we hope that their rights were duly recognized from now on. And this is the scenario before Portuguese European colonists arrived, and after today, what we have as indigenous people. In meantime, during the centuries 18 and 19, as I told you, we had this huge forced migration of enslaved people from Africa to America in general, but at least 4.9 million people were enslaved and brought to Brazil as slaves during this period. And after that, about this part of the timeline here, the end of century 19 and beginning of 20th century, the labor explained as a reason to replace the slave labor, but also as a policy of whitening the country. The immigration from different parts of the world, especially from Europe, were stimulated. For example, here we see historical photos of Italian immigrants disembarking, and this is the first Japanese ship arriving in Brazil. And just to have some idea in numbers, between the beginning of the Portuguese colonization until the beginning of the 19th century, most migrations to Brazil from Europe came from Portugal. But by the end of the 19th century until the half of the 20th century, we had these huge numbers of immigrants coming from different countries, especially Italy here, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Syria, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, and other parts of Europe. For example, we heard that the largest colony of Italians outside Italy is in Brazil, and the largest colony of Japanese people outside Japan is in Brazil. And this is why I'm here right now. I am 100% Brazilian, but genetically, I am 100% Japanese, because my four grandparents migrated to Brazil in the beginning of the 20th century. So in Brazil, we are this mix. We are the result of this mix of different cultures and different backgrounds, with several indigenous peoples and lots of traditional peoples already recognized, which are consequence of all these migrations. This is the general scenario. When we talk about social diversity and biodiversity conservation in Brazil, we are talking about this complex scenario. And the three things that affect biodiversity actually also affect traditional peoples who depend on biodiversity for their livelihood and for their cultural identity. For example, the habitat loss and fragmentation, the replacement of forested areas to agriculture, large-scale agriculture, pastures, livestock raising, mining, hydroelectric dams, etc. Also threatens lots of traditional people who depends on the forest, on the natural environment for their livelihood, for their cultural identity. And I like to use this IPLC, indigenous peoples and local communities, because in Brazil, we are not talking only about indigenous peoples, but also about traditional communities, which are typically ethnic groups, but not always are ethnic groups. One thing that's important is the self-recognition as a traditional people. This is in Brazilian context. A self-recognition as a group with a different identity who settled and colonized the area and who has strong links with their environment built all over the time. And it's a quite complicated definition because it's relative. We're always talking about a group in relation to other groups. Anyway, this photo here, we are with biology students learning from our colleagues from Xoclen indigenous ethnicity in southern Brazil. And our colleagues, our Xoclen colleagues were teaching our biology students about how they live in this area in Atlantic forest. I like to use in my studies also the definition of traditional ecological knowledge from Gad, Gilberts, and Folk as this cumulative body of knowledge, practices, and beliefs, which were developed by adaptive processes and passed between generations by cultural transmission about the relationships between living beings, including humans, including ourselves, with each other and with their environment. And why traditional ecological knowledge is important? It shows the continuity in the use of the resources, of the natural resources. It embeds knowledge about complex systems with an ecosystemic vision and a synchronous vision when we compare to the researcher vision, which is like a diachronic one. We go to the field work in different parts of time. We make observations framed in time and in space, and different of the traditional ecological knowledge that reflects the synchronical view. And traditional ecological knowledge is also important because of the adaptability. The knowledge can increase resilience. I like very much the ideas of Fikret Berks about these approaches. Another author that I like who wrote about ethnoecology is Virginia Nazarias. She states that ethnoecology is like a view from a point, is the situated knowledge, the knowledge situated in some space, in some time, and built from this experience. And if you are talking about these views from different points and from points of views, it's important to define from which window each one is looking. And my window is this one. As I told you, I'm 100% Brazilian, but my background, my genetic background is Japanese, but I only started to learn Japanese 5 years ago. I'm not Japanese speaking person, but obviously we know that what we are reflect of what our families are. And we can observe this in our daily life. And I think since the first time we came to Italy, and the first and only time we went to Japan, we could observe how some behaviors were incorporated in ourselves, even if we've never been in Italy or in Japan before. It's a very curious thing. Well, and today in Brazil, just to set to complete this scenario, we have about 4.5 million people considered as indigenous peoples and local communities. So not only indigenous peoples, but also other traditional communities, such as, for example, quilombolas, who are descendants of African slaves, small-scale agriculturists with different backgrounds, they are all within these numbers. Italian descendants, these were data from embassies. Okay, 25 million Italian descendants, 2 million Japanese descendants, Polish descendants about 1.5 million, Ukrainian descendants 500,000 descendants. Obviously, most of these people are not only Japanese or Italian descendants. For example, we have two sons who are both Japanese and Italian descendants, but born in Brazil. Well, let's go to the case studies. As I told you before, most of my research is focused in this part of Brazil, in the southern part, which is a region of Atlantic, originally with Atlantic forest, densely populated, and with received lots of immigrants from Europe. And this picture here is in Santa Catarina state. And so the social diversity in South Brazil is comprised by these descendants of European and other migrants, by African influences, indigenous peoples, and a mix of everything I showed you before. I want to show you some studies. For example, this one is from Rafaela Ludwinski. She was a doctoral student, and she studied Polish, the ethnobotany among Polish descendants in Brazil. Rafaela is here. Maybe she's online too. Rafaela is here learning with one of her interviewees. And she studied in 2 municipalities in Santa Catarina state within Atlantic forest. And she is also a Polish descendant. She was interested in the intergenerational plant knowledge among Polish descendants in Brazil. And if the knowledge varies with age, or if the knowledge varies depending on the descendant's generation, and if there was the strengthening of identity acts as a homogenizer of plant knowledge. So we could separate people who were part of cultural groups and people who are not part of cultural groups, cultural associations related to this Polish background. And she did 150 interviews in 2 municipalities, and she had lots of interesting qualitative data. For example, this is one of her interviewees showing her an old diary, and she told her that her mother and grandmother had several plants in the backyard. And the first time this interviewee came to Poland, she brought some plants that reminded her of her childhood. What we observed is when related to generations, when we compare the second and third generations here in the left side of the graph, we saw no difference in the richness of plants people know, but we saw a difference among the 4th generation. So people from the 4th generation know less plants than 2nd and 3rd generation. And this differences was not related to the age, because we had people with the same age in the 4th and the 3rd generation. Okay, we tested for age and no age difference. And we saw also no differences between people who participated in cultural associations like cultural clubs Polish cultural clubs and people who doesn't participate in these clubs. And these are the main species people told as known and used. And here we saw a mix of both native and non-native plants. And this is an interesting thing. So people are still using both native plants, both introduced plants and using native plants. For example, several plants used as food are very strongly related to this cultural identity, but they also mix together native plants as food. And several medicines also incorporate native plants. For example, this one here is a native Asteraceae. This one is a Aristolochiaceae, native also, but salvia is native from Europe. This is the dill, fennel, native from Europe, lychee from China, so on. So since we saw this identity related especially to food plants, what Rafaela did after this study was to compare only food plant knowledge between Polish and German descendants in these areas. We hypothesized that different ethnic memories could be related to the immigrants' experiences. In this region, in this municipality of São Bento do Sul, it's a small municipality with 84,000 people. More than 70% of them have Polish and or German ancestry. So we interviewed both people who had only Polish and people who have only German ancestry. And in this city, most German immigrants acted in trade or craft jobs, and Polish immigrants were more in farming activities in the rural areas. We saw a great overlap when we compare the plants used, the food plants used by Polish and by German immigrants, descendants. And 80% of the plants in this whole set are non-native species, but are still used in daily cuisine, and in several species were still recognized as identitarian ingredients for food. And even with this huge overlap, we can observe that some plants were more mentioned by German descendants in the side, and some plants predominate among Polish descendants. But most important than the plants that were used, we observed that the memory related to the recipes is an important identity marker, both among Polish descendants and among German descendants. Here, for example, a person making sour cucumbers, Polish traditional recipe, and here a clay barrel used to make the German sour cabbage. Well, another study that I want to show you is this one. The plants have a shape. It's about the use of plants in Afro-Brazilian religions in Santa Catarina Island, in Florianopolis, which is the capital of Santa Catarina. This was a study from Tiago, was a master's student at my lab. And in spite of his Italian cognome, He came from Bahia, which is a state with lots of Afro-Brazilian terreiros. Terreiros are like temples, like churches. And these Afro-Brazilian religions has, all of them have a strong linkage with plants. And in this study, we investigated which plants were used in the terreiros for both liturgical roles, but religious practices, and also for physical illnesses. Sometimes these two things are mixed. And if there are plants that stand out culturally among these religious groups. And we also investigated the adaptive maintenance and replacement in the use of plants of African origin. In Santa Catarina Island, we identified 40 terreiros, 40 temples, but only 27 could be interviewed. And there are different kinds of Afro-Brazilian religions in these terreiros. 13 was from Ritual de Almas de Angola, 11 from Umbanda, and 3 from Candomblé. And people mentioned 93 plants, but one thing that we were not expecting is that 16 species were used in all terreiros. All temples used a set of 16 species with very similar uses sometimes, and sometimes with different procedures, different liturgical roles. And more than half of the species were used for as in the liturgies, but several plants were also used as medicinal plants. And so going to a temple, to an Afro-Brazilian temple, people used to go to cure the spirits, but also diseases of the body. They are both. It's similar to blessing.
So if the plants were blessed, is it in the church or not?
Some of these plants were used in a way, in similar ways as blessing plants, but others are used as smokes or baths. So, and sometimes they are recommended by the priests as medicinal plants, as teas, for example. There's a mix of uses. And the origin of these plants used combines both plants from African origin here, from neotropical origin, both from South America and from Mexico and Central America, and several plants with origin in other parts of the world. So we can see this mix of traditions and mix of plants in this Afro-Brazilian rituals. I have another PhD student with ongoing studies with plants used in Afro-Brazilian religions. And she's also observing the replacement of some plants that were used in Africa, but were not found anymore in Brazil. And they are replaced by other species. And this is for our next chapters. Oh, going to indigenous people, this study is with indigenous partners from Guarani Mbia ethnicity. And this is part of a master dissertation of Julian, who is this first author here, Julian Carlotto de Andrade. He has both Italian background, but also Guarani background. His grandmother is Guarani. And all the other authors, except Fernanda and me, were Guaranis, who agreed to take part of this research. Julian was interested in the exchanges of plants between Guarani villages. Guarani is an indigenous people who occupy several parts of Atlantic forest in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. The Guarani territory is spreads all over these three countries, southern part of Brazil. And Guarani people used to migrate, to travel all over this territory. And Julian wants to describe the exchange networks of plants with medicinal and healing importance between Guarani villages in this part of Brazil, and also to discuss the importance of plants and environments for the ecocultural Guarani health. And his sampling effort was huge, but this huge sampling effort resumes in 12 key interviewers in 7 villages, because to reach 7 villages, 7 Guarani villages, he needed a huge effort, not only to go to these places, but also to make the contacts with the leaderships, with the elders, and all the building of the trust in this research is an important part of the process. And we observed exchanges with 19 villages. Here in this map, we are in the southern part of Brazil. This part here is Argentina, and the different colors show different forest formations. We cannot see here, but there are some villages with stars, which are the villages where he had interviewees, and the villages with dots were other villages mentioned by these villages where he had interviewees. And what we observed is a huge movement of seeds and seedlings of different plants used for medicinal or for healing practices of these people occurring nowadays, occurring today. So this study adds a small brick to the understanding of how indigenous people in South America could contribute to the landscape formation, to the biodiversity distribution in all South America, which breaks with that idea of pristine forests that are being revisited in the last years. And Ivaldo also has important studies related to this. And the last case study I want to show you is this one from Adélio Pinto, who was Caingang student. He's from the Caingang ethnic group. This is not published. It's written only in Portuguese and in Caingang. This is the abstract here of his study in Caingang. Unfortunately, I don't know how to read Caingang. And this shows how an indigenous student did his research about sustainable management of raw materials for crafts. This is Adélio here, this one. He also participated in these activities, and he was talking about sustainable management. This is the monography, his monography for the graduation course as a, I don't know the equivalent in English. It's a university course for indigenous professors, for people who want to to work as teachers in indigenous schools. But this course is only for indigenous people. Yeah, I think we have very few universities with this kind of course in Brazil. Actually, our is one of these universities. The first requirement to be part of this course, you need to be indigenous. And Adélio lives in a very, very small indigenous village, which is here in the northern part of Rio Grande do Sul. But this scale here is 500 meters, less than 1 kilometer of indigenous village, surrounded by soybean plantations, monoculture by every other side. And they are trying to keep these practices of doing crafts, doing baskets with native plants, such as bamboos and some lianas. And what he did in his monography was describe how people harvest the plants, how people do the dyeing process, and how people also wave the baskets, how they combine the colors, and especially how people have to learn with the elders, and how this learning must be inserted within the scholar environment. This is a student at the school, at the indigenous school, learning how to make basketries. And I think the importance of this kind of work is to give voice to indigenous people who create and who keep this knowledge, not as an external researcher describing Kaingang basketry. This is research done by Kaingang themselves. Okay, and some perspectives, some possibilities for studies. Some of them we'll probably try to fulfill during the next months. One thing that interests me when I talked to Renata is this issue about plants used by migrant people, from people who go from one place to another, especially because in Brazil, especially in the South Brazil, we have this huge amounts of immigrants from different parts of Europe, from different parts of East Europe, and studies focusing on groups who share the same, some of the same identity, and how local knowledge is adapted to new and different social environmental contexts. For example, I know something about how immigrants use plants in Brazil, but I know nothing about how people use plants here in Eastern Europe, and how people moving plants can shape new environments, and which contributions to biodiversity conservation can arise from this scenario. This photo here is in Curitiba, is the capital of Paraná, one of the southern states in Brazil, where there are a strong colony of Ukrainian people. I have also some interest in historical perspectives, and this is a quite personal history because of my background. And as I told you, Japanese migration to Brazil started in the beginning of the 1908, about 100 and something years ago. But the first Japanese to be in Brazil were outcasts traveling in a Russian ship in the first Russian circumnavigation. And the one and only port they stopped in South America was a city called Desterro, which currently is the city I live in Brazil, which is Florianopolis. And they spent about a month between December 1803 and January 1804, and described some of the environments and of the some species very roughly. And my question here is how ethnoecology and ethnobotany approaches can help to refine some inaccuracies in these historical records. For example, most of the interpretations of these registers, which were made in Japanese, most of these interpretations tells us that these images are from of bananas, but I don't think there are bananas, because there are several reproductions of the same images. They were done like handwritten. This is like a personal interest by myself for historical research. And another thing that we were discussing last week is how we can use these approaches to decolonize ethnobiology and ethnobotany. I was part of this effort in this article with Alex McAlvey, Ina Vanderbroek, and several other authors, where we discuss how we can join efforts to decolonize institutions, projects, and scholarship in ethnobiology, even if we do not recognize at first that we are colonized. For example, in the whole context I show you, I told you that Brazil was colonized by Portuguese, but today we are colonized by several other cultures in different ways. Colonization is not dependent on settlement, and ethnobiology as a science that began with external observers describing how people use plants, use environments, or know biological things, in certain way started as a colonizing science. And we need to face this reality, and we need to change this reality. And I think we had lots of things to learn when we exchange ideas with different groups, when it relates to ethnobiology and ethnobotany. And finally, I always focus to this direction of thinking about biodiversity conservation. I believe that understanding traditional livelihoods helps us to understand how biodiversity conservation can be successful in different ways. We have to find different solutions adapted to different realities, especially where we have these areas overlapping. There are just areas for conservation overlapping with areas historically occupied by traditional people. Diverse people promote the use and the conservation of diverse species and environments. I think these are the general ideas that I wanted to share with you. Grazie. Obrigada. Thank you. Domo arigato. I thank especially again to Ca' Foscari University in the person of Renata Sulkand, who invited me here and who accepted me as a visiting scholar. Thanks to my university, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina in Brazil, the two post-graduation programs I'm part of, the post-graduation in botany and in ecology, all people of the group of my laboratory. If you want to know more about our lab, which I share with Nivaldo, who is here, you can access our webpage. And I also thank to CNPq, which is for a research grant to support most of my studies.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And now it's a time for questions.
I don't know if you can share the people here.
Yeah,
No. If I interrupt here, maybe.
Can you, okay, yeah, can you hear me? And well, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was a very big pleasure to hear you and to know your research. And my question, well, first of all, I'm from Chilean University, so I was very happy to be closer to my geographical university. Well, my question is about the last topic you talk about, and the colonizing and colonization. And I'm still curious about what do you mean for colonization? Because from my studies and my readings, I learn more about coloniality, also in Portuguese languages. So I was curious about how could you develop studies about colonization, and that's it.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I like Chile so much too. We went in a travel to Chile last month. I think it's more than study the colonizations, how we can decolonize our own studies. This is the point. Because sometimes we use only methods and procedures from the Occidental science when we are approaching different systems of knowledge. And sometimes we have to break these ways of thinking, of making science. And obviously, we are within universities, built within this way of thinking, this way of organize the science. But how we can absorb these other ways of doing science into the universities? This is the question. And I don't think that we have only one way to do this. It depends on the context. It depends on the place. For example, in our university, we started to learn a lot when these undergrad courses for directed only for indigenous people started, because we never been we not learn how to teach indigenous peoples. We have to learn with them about how to teach them. This is tricky, but it's hard, and it's important to do this. I'm not sure if I could answer your question, because obviously I think that there are people from history and from social sciences that actually study decolonization, but I think it's not this point that I want to approach. It's how we can decolonize our own research doing ethnobotany, doing ethnobiology.
More question?
Do we have questions online?
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and yeah, a lot of things, but just want to ask something about. So you were citing IPBES, you were citing IPLCs, and all this framework, and I mean, in the perspective of decolonizing science in some way. So I'm Italian, and I'm a physicist from a background, so I come from very like, if you want, colonized perspective of science. And yeah, the point is that, okay, when we read reports, when we read, all this effort of putting like indigenous knowledge within the framework of science in a way that we can learn stuff, from this, I still find it very. So I want to know, what do you think about this? What's the process you have in mind in doing this? And because I think when so it was my experience was when doing the reviews of this, adaptation pathways or how do you call it, like resilient pathways inspired by indigenous local knowledge. I found always that we have. So we are not doing it right. I don't know. How do you think? Yeah, thank you.
I completely agree. Because we have a long way to go. I know that the IPBS initiatives are trying to include indigenous perspectives, but they are also learning how to do this. For example, I'm part of one national BPS initiative, which is inspired by IPBS, is connected actually to the international. And when writing the synthesis, we concluded that we need to have a part of the report written by indigenous peoples. Otherwise, we are only using their voices to support our arguments. And this resulted in an effort to include a chapter based on indigenous voices. But how this will connect in the final product, we still don't know, but we are learning how to do this. The point is that to do this in an authentic way, we have to open more spaces in academic institutions and universities for indigenous peoples. And this is a long way to go. And this is why I was, when we are discussing last week with Renata, I incentivize my students to research their own backgrounds, because in this way, things begin to make sense in thinking about the colonialism too. But I think that we need to open more space, more academic spaces for indigenous peoples.
I think that here in Europe, we first need to really understand that also we have indigenous people here. And well, major part of Europeans are indigenous people, and major parts of them are colonized in one or another way, without having the right to actually express their opinions and propose different attitudes, especially from the scientific point of view. So if we assume that the people who work with land don't have the knowledge, and the science comes and teaches them how to use the land, I don't think this is the right approach, if they have been there for long enough to actually survive on this land. So the acknowledging of Europe as a center initial of colonization, still having indigenous population, which needs protection, which needs to be given voice. This is another thing. I think this is the task of our group to work on.
Sure. I can imagine the complexity when you are looking to European history. In Brazil, you have 500 years or so of history. Here you have centuries of people being colonized.
Yeah, with very diverse influences, political and also very brutal influences, as the same as on American continent. So, thank you very much, Natalia.
Thank you so much.
Do we have more questions? Yes, Jiblia, please.
Again, my name is Jim Lea. I'm a fisherman daughter from the Philippines, and I'm exploring the knowledge of fishers about the uses of plants in the Laguna Lake and also in the Lagoon of Venice. And one situation in the Philippines is that part of the biodiversity loss in the lake is the activity of could be the activity from the hydroelectric power corporation there. And I'm thinking when you also mentioned the biodiversity loss case in one of your case studies mentioned, is it also the case that not only the building of the hydroelectric power or the hydroelectric dam affects the biodiversity, or also is it also the activity of the hydroelectric dam, like the cleaning of the pipes or releasing of the chlorine in the nearest body of water? Does it also affect the plant diversity in the nearby body of water of the in that hydroelectric dam?
Yes, I think both the construction of the hydroelectric, but also after the hydroelectric, the dam is set, because the whole river flux is changed, and it affects several kilometers before and after the dam. Yes, it happens. Not the chlorine, but eutrophization processes also are important. And yeah, I think in Brazil, most of the impacts are related to these changes on the hydric regime. When we talk about traditional people and who depends on fish, and yes, not only during the construction.
Yes, those are some of also the challenges happening in the Laguna Lake, which I'm studying about.
Oh,
And second question, when it's about the review that I'm doing currently, and there is this in one of the result is that we found out that same family is being used for same reason. For example, one family is being used for catching fish in one region, and we found out that it is also being used in another region. So when I discussed this with Professor Nara, we're thinking that these are very helpful in the conservations in those regions, and also it also another reason for this family to be explored by other regions as well. Do you also think so?
yes, I think, but I think it depends on how these uses happens. Can you give me more details about how these uses are different?
No, the different region, different countries, for example, I could not remember exactly now, but for example, Italy and Philippines, for example, they use this one family for catching fish. They use this plant species for catching fish in their countries. So do you think that aside from the reason that it is being helpful in the conservation of those areas, it is also one of the reason why this family should be also the use of these families in other regions should also be explored? So it could also help in the conservation in other regions.
In other regions, yes. If you think about conservation in a broader scale, yes, for sure. But maybe depends on the context of each use, each fishery region. But as a general idea, I think yes, it can benefit.
Okay. Thank you very much.